Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and I hope everyone is adequately fed and watered. The rest of this afternoon, will have us hear another talk by Dr. Anthony Reddie, who is Director at Oxford Centre for Religion and also Extraordinary Professor of Theological Ethics at the University of South Africa. And we will also then have time for a discussion where more of your questions on the topics explored so far will be answered. I encourage you all to ask whatever questions come to mind, and also feel free to think more deeply, especially those who will be remaining for the remainder of the day, on some of the issues raised about the legacy of Martin Luther King. But that's enough from me. I want to make space for our remaining speaker this afternoon. So thank you, Anthony.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here to share some words with you this afternoon. Martin Luther King. My talk will be very complementary to the two previous ones that have gone. Slight difference in that I'm a theologian. I did my first degree in history, but that's a long time ago, and we won't talk about that. I'm a theologian, so what I want to do is to look at the theological antecedents of Martin Luther King. So what were his formation, because obviously he didn't just come out of a vacuum. He was formed by a particular tradition. And I want to say something about that tradition, because I think that Black prophetic tradition is still with us, and I think is still needed ever more than perhaps at any other time in the past. In 2014 and 2015, I worked for a year at Bristol Baptist College. And in the final term of that year, the film Selma came out. And I remember taking a group of students as part of their Baptist formation for ministry to go watch the film. It was kind of 3-line whip, so we all kind of went off to the cinema en bloc, watched the film, and then came back and had a long discussion about it in their class looking at Baptist history and principles. And one of the questions I said to them, I said, so what do you think is going on in this story between Martin Luther King and the officials in Selma? And they said, well, King clearly is a Christian and he is fighting for social justice. And he's up against a white person and white officials who are not Christians. And I paused for a second and I said, well, actually, fundamentally, that's where you're wrong. Actually, I said, this is an intra-Christian argument. Because all the people who are arguing for segregation would believe themselves to be Christians. And many of them actually would also probably be Baptist, probably Southern Baptist. So therefore, it's not only an intra-Christian argument, in some contexts, it may even be an intra-Baptist argument. King clearly has a different view around the social implications of Christianity that come from, at the very heart of it, an alternative understanding of who God is revealed in Jesus Christ. And I want to argue that that same battle is the one that we're still arguing over now. Because in the context where we have seen quite recently, significant numbers of white evangelicals vote for Donald Trump on the basis that Trump is an expression of Christian discipleship. But also closer to home, in our own context, where we have seen a kind of white English nationalism being invoked as a way of arguing that Brexit is also an expression of God's revelation for Britain in this context. To say that those arguments of contestation around who is God revealed in Jesus Christ are not old arguments, they're continuing arguments, because they go right back to the very source of the creation of the faith itself, right from its earliest days. This question of who is Jesus and where is Jesus to be found is an argument in the early church, but it's an argument in the 21st century. And King, I think, is one of the chief exemplars for a Black prophetic tradition, what Cornel West calls a form of revolutionary Christianity. And it's revolutionary because what it does, it is speaking truth to power. It's speaking truth to the existence of empire and forms of exploitation and capitalism and greed, in which Christianity has become so embedded that we don't even see that we have been colluding with it for many centuries. And I'll share a little bit about that in a moment in terms of how it's always become hidden in plain sight, that actually much of British Christianity actually lies implicated in a collusion with empire and exploitation. But they're back to Selma. So the film, which I remember watching it and just being captivated by the performance, actually depicts King clearly, as Richard has said, and has other speakers, now I just forgot, Hannah has said, that actually, that you have to put King into a social context. Yes, he was a social prophet. Yes, he was involved in politics. But first and fundamentally, he was a Christian pastor. He was a Baptist pastor. And so his social vision is not a secular humanist one. It's one that comes out of the scriptures. And this tradition that he's a part of, this Black radical tradition, goes right back to the end of the 18th century. In 1794, Richard Allen, who was a member of the American Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, walks out of the church and takes a group of African Americans with him, enslaved Black people, because they're sat in the balcony, so much like a big church like here in Philadelphia, and they're sat right at the back, at the furthest point away because of segregation. That's where the slaves are allowed to sit, in a tradition that promotes egalitarianism and equality. So the sheer hypocrisy of that leads Allen to march his people out and say, we will form our own church. And so the oldest independent Black church in America, and which is still going, is the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, of which he's the first bishop. And that tradition is not necessarily separated by doctrine, because if you look at the doctrines of the AME and the doctrines of the United Methodist Church, they're still remarkably similar, based upon, I guess, Wesleyan principles. The difference lies in where they believe God is located in the world amongst humankind. And for Allen and for many of his followers at the time and the descendants afterwards, they are clear that God is not found amongst the rich and the powerful and those who are exploiting others. God is found in the midst of the suffering and exploitation of Black bodies. So 2 generations on from him, we have another famous African-American Episcopal bishop, Henry McNeil Turner. And in 1899, Henry McNeil Turner says that God is a Negro. A revolutionary statement at the time. 1899, in his church newspaper, he says, God is Black. And when he's saying that, he's building on the legacy that comes from this Black prophetic tradition that says that for all the ways in which white slave-owning Christianity has tried to convince itself and others that somehow they are worshiping God and that God is on their side, and of course, we know how they distorted scripture. So Paul's writings, particularly Colossians 3:22, Ephesians 6:5, slaves obey your masters. Paul's letter to Philemon, where he doesn't say to Philemon, let Onesimus go free. He sends Onesimus back, but does though say crucially, treat him as a friend and a brother. And a friend of a brother. So whatever arguments one wants to make about Paul's letters, and that's a whole other subject to which people do big PhDs on this stuff. So we'll skip that bit. However you look at it, what Paul is still saying is that within the ecclesia, slaves and free are brothers and sisters in Christ, which is still a far sight from Christian slave owners believing that they are saved on the one hand and yet can exploit black bodies to the point of death on the other, and God has nothing to say about it. And God has nothing to say about it because what white slave owners believed was that the domestication of God within their geopolitics made God and white power pretty much the same things. So King's antecedents are these major thinkers. Also, one has to put into that pantheon Benjamin Elijah Mays, who was his personal mentor, who taught him at Morehouse College. Alongside that is Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman is probably much more well known now than Benjamin Mays is. And in 1940, Thurman writes this brilliant book, Jesus and the Disinherited. Still in print. And Jesus and the Disinherited. What Thurman shows is, again, is that this radical tradition says that for all the blandishments of empire and power of white supremacy, Christ is not located in those places amongst the status quo. He's located amongst the disinherited. He's located amongst those people who are on the margins and who are told that they are nobodies. Part of why this is hidden in plain sight, and therefore one of the prophetic aspects of King coming to Britain in 61 and talking about colonialism and talking about the exploitation of black migrants who have come from the colonies as British subjects invited to do so. Let's not forget, like, these people didn't impose themselves upon Britain. They were invited to come and, to be blunt, to do the jobs that white people did not want to do. So why is that hidden in plain sight? Why is it that for the most part, Christendom was perfectly happy and content with the exploitation of black bodies and believing that to be entirely consistent and consonant with God's own self? So let me read to you something that many of us will have read many, many times. This is John's account of Jesus before Pilate. John 18, verses 28 to 40. Then they brought Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate came out to them and said, "What accusation are you bringing against this man?" They answered and said to him, If this man were not a criminal, he would not have been handed over to you." So Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, and this is the key point here, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." This happened so that the word which he had said himself, indicating what kind of death he would die, that it would be fulfilled. Therefore Pilate entered the praetorium again and summoned Jesus and said to him, "You are the king of the Jews." Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and chief priests handed you over to me. So what have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this purpose I've been born, and for this I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After this, he came out again to the Jews and said to them, "I found no grounds at all for charges in his case. However, you have a custom that I release one prisoner for you at Passover. Therefore, do you wish that I release for you the king of the Jews?" So they shouted again, saying, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a rebel. Amen. Hidden in plain sight in this encounter is Jesus, who is a colonized, oppressed Jew from Galilee, who is in conversation with Pontius Pilate, who is a Roman governor. He is Caesar's eyes and ears. He is Caesar's right-hand man overseeing this part of the Roman Empire. And it's very interesting in that when Pilate says to them, well, actually, to the Jews, take him away and judge him according to your law, they say, well, actually, we can't kill him because we have no authority in our own country. Because the imperial country, the imperial power has imposed itself on us, and the only law that matters is the law of Caesar, which Pontius Pilate represents. Now, here's the thing that I talk about hidden in plain sight, that King represents the alternative tradition that critiques this. How many times have we sat, probably in this very church as well, and read that passage as Christians, and we imagine ourselves as British, or to be more blunt, you as white people, because it ain't me as black people. You read that and you imagine ourselves to be Jesus. We're not Jesus, we're Pontius Pilate. The British Empire was built upon the 3 C's: commerce, civilization, and Christianity, said David Livingstone, a famous explorer and missionary in Southern Africa. He himself said the base of the British Empire is commerce, civilization, and Christianity. Christianity goes hand in hand with empire. Now, to be clear, not every missionary was an imperialist, and certainly in the Baptist tradition, there is a lot to be said for anti-imperialist people like Carey and various other people who challenged it. But let's be very clear, they were always in a minority. If it had been a majority, history would be different. So Christianity is an imperial religion from the moment Constantine converts. Therefore, by the time the British get hold of it and they're transforming the faith across the world, what they are doing is making people colonial subjects under the guise of a form of Christianity that will reinforce their power. So how is it then that we then sit here, read the scriptures, and imagine ourselves to be part of a colonized, oppressed movement, when actually we represent Pontius Pilate? A friend of mine, Reverend Dr. Peter Crutchley, who's writing an article for a book I'm co-editing next year, he describes Pontius Pilate as the first white man in the scriptures. He probably wasn't literally white, but he's white in the sense in which what he represents is colonial power. He is a governor. He controls countries and tells indigenous peoples how to live by the laws that are sent from the center of Rome, rather than what's happening in the local regions. That's exactly what the British did. To 24% of the world, all those bits in pink. And so the heresy of a Christianity that then suddenly moves away from being based upon a colonized Jew under Roman imperialism into this Christ of faith now that actually guarantees and supports empire. It's probably one of the biggest bits of eschatology that's ever happened in our sight. King, the power of King is that he becomes the exemplar of this black tradition. What James Cone says is one of the architects of black liberation theology. So Cone says there are 2 architects of black theology, which we saw actually pictured in Hannah's presentation. But the black bit is Malcolm X. The bit around black politics, the bit around black self-determination, the bit around black affirmation, self-love of being black, not being Negro, not being colored, but being proud of being black, that comes from Malcolm X. But the theology in black theology that is overwhelmingly a Christian theology comes from Martin Luther King. And King, in many respects, becomes the exemplar of this tradition that goes right back to the 18th century of speaking truth to power, of speaking truth to the vested self-interest of a status quo that wants us to believe that everything that is happening so far is kind of coterminous with the kingdom of God. King's power to speak truth to vested interests, whether it's a militarism in America, whether it is a neo or post-colonial government in 1961, and saying, actually, you're not Christian unless you do these things, unless you repent and show justice to ordinary people on the margins, then you're not being Christian. It doesn't matter how much you craft your liturgies and how much propaganda you set out to convince people of how Christian you are. The test is, are you showing justice to those on the margins? Are you loving your neighbor, irrespective of who your neighbor is, especially if your neighbor comes in black skin? Are you showing justice by them? And if you're not doing that, then God will judge you. Irrespective of how long you spent in church and irrespective of how many ties you've thrown, God will judge you. King represents the exemplar of this black revolutionary tradition that we now find aspects of it in the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, to be clear, Black Lives Matter, like civil rights, is not a Christian movement. It's heterodox. It comes in a variety of perspectives. It's not based upon particular strong leadership like King or like other male figures. Actually, amongst the three people who founded it, two were women who were non-binary. And yes, there are aspects of the movement that are incredibly radical to the point of being, well, if not dangerous, and certainly some of their views are problematic. But actually within the movement, and certainly I'm in contact with many of them, are people in the Black Lives Matter movement who would say that we take our cue from King himself. That like the battle and the fights that King were doing through the lens of his Christian faith, through the lens of worshipping a Jesus that is on the side of the margins, not on the side of the powerful. That doesn't mean that God doesn't love everybody, but God will call people to account. Matthew 25:31-46. When did we show love and compassion to those who are on the margins, those who are naked, those who are strangers? That is not the faith of imperialism and exploitation and capitalism and greed, no matter how much our church history has tried to portray it as such. King's genius being in this place 60 years ago was to speak truth to power. Our struggle being ensconced in empire, and all our churches have been involved in empire. So I grew up as a Methodist. So like my brother who's going to become a turncoat and become an Anglican, obviously, you know, I'm joking, obviously, I love him still. As Methodists, we love to mythologize. So like we love to tell everybody that Wesley was anti-slavery. Yes, he was, but that doesn't mean that other Methodists were. Methodists still held slaves. Baptists still held slaves. Actually, probably the only tradition that probably does not have blood on its hands is probably the Quakers. Most of our churches were happy to collude with empire and colonialism. Most of our churches were even happy in the early 60s to tell black people who would come here as members of the churches not to join because like, we don't want colored people in this church. King challenges all of those internalization of white supremacy and says in the end, to be a Christian disciple is to carry your cross and to be in solidarity with all those who are constantly still being crucified and speaking truth to power. The reason why I think his life has endured is because his underpinnings were not secular humanism. It was the gospel that is timeless. That Jesus in the first century, who is an oppressed, colonized Jew, is in the 21st century alongside every single group and people and persons who are marginalized and told that they're nobodies, people who are in refugee camps, people who are stuck in holding camps because we in Fortress Europe don't want to let them in. In all those places where people are nobodies, particularly people of darker skin, Jesus is there on their side. And I still believe as a Black liberation theologian that when the scroll gets rolled up and we're all judged, I suspect that there are some very, very powerful people who probably think that they're on the right side of history who will be judged also. Final word should always go to King. And King says that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Thank you.
So much. Okay, thank you so much. I'd love to take some questions from the wider congregation audience. I just think it's very important to be able to talk openly about the theological background and underpinning of Martin Luther King and also its relevance to today. So I think my first question would be, it feels like, as you said, Black Lives Matter is very, very heterodox. There's so many people who bring all faith traditions and none to their activism. But even so, there's a sense, me, myself, as a Christian, that the language of Black liberation theology is there, but the figure of the Black liberatory theologian seems somewhat absent. Is there any reason for that, apart from the sense of it's a collective movement? There's no much, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the movement has learned some key things, I think, from the civil rights movement, really. First is that undoubtedly the civil rights movement was undoubtedly patriarchal and sexist. So we know that a lot of Black women did a lot of the legwork, and yet, and a lot of the times, you know, I'm not, there's one bit in the film Selma where all the men are turning up and the women are in the kitchen and they're cooking the food for them, and they come out and there's lots of banter. But when they sit around the table, there's not one woman around the table. All the women actually, they then go back to the kitchen and it's the men who sit around. And of course, all of them are all ordained men as well. So even though, again, it's a movement where lay people are doing a lot of the legwork, the power lies and the iconography lies with ordained men. So I think some of it is also a deliberate movement away from that kind of archetypal strong leader thing into a much more broader movement that brings in lots of other people. Some of it, I think, is also tactical as well. That what we've also seen about movements is that those that are built upon the cult of personality are always then susceptible either to the leader having feet of clay that all of us have, because all of us are sinful and fallen short of the glory of God, or you actually kill them off, and the movement then withers, which is what we see what happens to the civil rights movement. It pretty much wanes very quickly once King has gone because it's held together by his huge force of personality. So one of the other aspects of it being diffuse is that if you move away from the cult of personality, it's much harder then to kill the movement because like you can't just target an iconic figure that makes it easy. Some of it, I think, also as well has been that those who have not been able to subscribe to Christianity for whatever reason have often found the civil rights focus on Christianity to be quite exclusive. And so again, I think some of it moving away from a strong Christian base, which obviously is problematic in one respect. In another respect, I can understand that, because what they're also saying is, so again, if we go back to the civil rights movement, we saw the picture of Bayard Rustin. He was an amazing guy who wrote most of King's speeches for him, but he was a Marxist and was gay. So therefore, he's good enough to do the work, but not good enough to sit on the front and be seen because he's seen as a liability. That tells you a certain level of hypocrisy that says it's good enough to do the work, but not good enough to be seen because he might embarrass us. And so therefore, I think some of the movement away from a very strict kind of church movement into something that's broader is, I think, actually quite deliberate.
Are there any other questions that anyone would like to ask?
And then decided that one thing I've noticed about the church in 30 years of leadership, segregation is alive, kicking action. So, and now we're in this sort of a very groupy, very good-looking Baptist church in South affluent Southwest.
Okay.
How do I tackle this? What give me an answer to this?
Oh, wow.
It's got a long time.
I'm tempted to say I'm good, but I'm not that good. Yeah, I think first and foremost is at least to name it. It's to name it, because I think one of the things that we have seen in the last 50 years of our church has been the nature of white flight. And there's not one theologian, not one, well, start again. There's not one white theologian, because black people have written about it. There's not one white theologian who's ever written about that. So we're good at writing about metaphysics, but not good about writing. Why is it that when a certain number of people from a different ethnic or cultural group become quite significant in the church, white people leave? We've never gotten to the heart of that in terms of talking about it. So first things first is I think to have an honest conversation around what is it about church that attracts us? Because that's what we know, it's lots of things. Sometimes it's the theology of it, sometimes it's about the people who are there, because obviously we met friends, we have part of kinship groups, it becomes part of our lifestyle. And I think right at the heart of the church, in from its earliest days, and we see Paul writing about that in his letters, it's this tension between being a spiritual entity that transcends difference, and the reality that all of us as human beings belong to our gang, that all of us are tribal. We often use that as a pejorative about Africa, but all of us are tribal, you know. I mean, so I live in leafy Moseley. Those who know Birmingham know that, like, we are the righteous folk who vote and write the right way, you know. If God just listened to us a little bit more, the kingdom of heaven would be that bit closer, you know, because obviously, you know, I'm like, we read The Guardian and we're reasonable and we're kind of liberal and we don't like intolerance, and that's my gang. So surprise, surprise, the church I go to is kind of full of people who kind of share my similar worldview. That's always been the tension of the church. It's that tension between being countercultural and being different from the world, and yet knowing who we are as human beings, we often gravitate to people who are a bit like us because they reinforce our worldview. So it starts with at least having an honest conversation about why we are here. What keeps us here? What might be the means that might make us feel uncomfortable? Because one of the things about white flight is that white people never talk about it, like they just leave under stealth. So the church I was a member of for many years, a Black Methodist church, when it closed in 2011, was never intended to be a Black Methodist church. 100 years ago, it was a wealthy white Wesleyan church. Black people moved in Windrush, kind of 60s, it was kind of 90-10. White people were still okay. By the time I turned up in the early 90s, it was about 60-40 Black. By the time it closed, you could count the white people on one hand. And if you talk to some white people at the left, everyone had a good reason except for the honest reason, which was suddenly it didn't feel like home anymore. It's interesting how white people, to feel at home, need to create space. That's what colonialism is all about, and apartheid. And it's about space and creating space of difference from others. We need theologically to talk about that and to be honest about it. So it starts off with having that conversation. And at least maybe if you have the conversation and you're honest about it, it then might mean that some people won't leave because they feel too ashamed to do so. Actually, that might not be a bad thing.
Thank you. A couple of observations. So we've had London Quakers have contacted us online through the chat, and they've observed that a number of Quakers held slaves, including William Penn, and they note that people still have to live with the tension of that legacy. So thank you to London Quakers for that. If I can offer just sort of an observation, I was really interested in what you were saying about how Christendom sort of appropriates the attitude of Jesus towards the colonial powers. And I'm just thinking in terms of King using the book of Revelation for his sermon that he gave here and in other places with the three dimensions. The book of Revelation, of course, is this powerful anti-imperial text, which once Christianity becomes part of Christendom, it doesn't know what to do with. So it throws it into the future, and it ceases to be about the here and now, and it just becomes about the future. And in King's sermon, he drags it back into the present, because the New Jerusalem, equal in all three dimensions, isn't something in the future. He says, this is who you must be now. Yeah. And it's this drawing of this text back into an anti-imperial narrative that I think he is so powerful on with that. I don't know if you want to come back on that, and then I'm going to ask Solomon to just come in because he's got a question for you as well. But
indeed, oh yeah, absolutely, yes. You know, I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen happen to the scriptures through Christendom is a spiritualization of what were in their time deeply political comments on imperialism and empire. So one of the things we know about Jesus was that he was an anti-imperialist, but of course he's a revolutionary of love. You know, so it's a revolution, but it's not based upon violence. It's based upon this radical idea of loving your enemies. But you're absolutely right, Simon. So oftentimes, therefore, when we get into the reading of Revelation, we don't see it as this countercultural narrative that says, actually, Caesar is not God. Because in that context of when it's written, Caesar's not just the head of the empire, Caesar is God. So therefore, to proclaim Jesus as Lord is to make a revolutionary statement to say that actually all the temporal powers that feel that they can execute, crucify, and kill resistance are wrong, because evil, what the cross tells us, that evil never has the last word. Evil never has the last word, and the last word is God. The first word is God, and the last word is God. And Caesar, and all the people who pretend to be Caesars, be they Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or various other people who feel like they have untrammeled power to do what they like, God calls them to account.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wonder, how should king be represented in the context of his faith, his personality as a moral leader, and some of his personal view as radical Christianity, as a radical preacher in a sense? How should he be represented? How should we look to him to see all of these different traits of King, Dr. King?
I think, to use King's own words, King himself would have said that as a Christian disciple, as a minister, he believed himself to be a revolutionary of love. That he was a revolutionary. He is fighting for a radical change in how we live as human beings in the world. But he's doing that through the ethics of the love of Jesus Christ, which is why that is central, therefore, to his pacifism and to his non-violent forms of resistance. That's not incidental. That is central to who he is, because he sees in Jesus a non-violent, loving revolution. Yeah, so basically a revolutionary of love.
another comment in the chat, apparently. Okay, this is from Julian, who says, a thoroughly interesting talk. Note, to try to be fair to David Livingstone, the order of the words on his statue at Victoria Falls has the order Christianity, Commerce and Civilization. But where there have been a couple of attempts to pull that statue down, what is the speaker's view of the roads must fall? He will probably have seen Professor Mary Beard's comments this week. It's a worthwhile goal to try and is it a worthwhile goal to try and demolish statues, buildings and plaques? Or are there rather more important tasks to achieve some of the principles enunciated by Professor Reddie and, of course, MLK?
Okay, well, two things, really. Okay, like, so first, actually, by putting Christianity first, that doesn't make it any better. Okay, so Christianity is first or last, it's still commerce and civilization and empire. That still equals exploitation, so that's the first thing. But I think in terms of the statues, I mean, I suppose I've got a fairly pragmatic view. One is that I think for every statue that could be pulled down, what we could do is simply move them to a museum and have an educational exhibition around them. Because they're quite symbolic, that they tell us something about the people who put them up at the time. It tells us something about the people who we want to hold up as heroes, because statues are by their very nature, they are one-dimensional. Okay, I know that they're literally three-dimensional, but kind of. Obviously, so maths was not my favorite subject of physics. But essentially, they tell us something about ourselves. So whilst I think it's tempting to say that let's just pull them down and demolish them, I'm all for moving them into other places, because part of the problem is at the moment, they're often in places of celebration. That's the point of a statue. Like, you put a statue up because you think someone's a hero. If you move it into a more neutral space, so it's not heroic anymore, it's now about contestation. How do we learn from that? How do we get into a debate around the fact that these figures are often conflicting? That's my middle view. But actually, it's not about statues, of course. It's about much more substantive stuff around economics and around power and around the issues of marginalization. So I don't want to get fixated about statues. Certainly in Oxford, we have a lot of the arguments about the Rhodes statue that's in the forecourt of Oriel College. And that has very much sort of divided the university. My view again is Oxford owns several museums. Pitt Rivers Museum, Ashmolean, probably the most famous one. He will be more than at home in any of those museums, actually, alongside all the other artifacts that Oxford has stolen from all over the world. And that would make great exhibition for school children and for historians in Oxford to have conversations about their legacies that are complex, because in Rhodes' case, he was an imperialist, he was a colonialist. And yet actually, alongside that, what you also have is the Rhodes Foundation that includes Rhodes Scholarship that have been immensely helpful for people from the Caribbean and Africa to come to Oxford and get education. So for example, Norman Washington Manley, one of the architects of Jamaican independence, comes on the Rhodes Scholarship. That then gives him the education to come back and to critique and to subvert empire. So it is conflictual. But the best way, therefore, to do that is within an educational space.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you once again. We're now going to open up our panel. So it's going to move the furniture around a little bit. But thank you for the questions as well. And we can just, yeah. I'd like to invite our speakers back up to the pulpit, if you could. I've got so many burning questions. Yeah, I'll sit. Yeah. Adjusting the heights as always. And yeah, can we get another round of applause for everyone, please? Because I just think that was incredible and so well articulated and so well discussed. But thank you so much for your time and also for provoking such an interesting discussion when it comes to where our position is now and today, and in the current fight for not just Black liberation, but the liberation of all oppressed peoples. I really wanted to start off with a general question, which is, what is your personal connection to the legacy of Martin Luther King, and where does he sit for you in terms of like your journey as academics, faith journeys, but also as people? Because I think that he's such a compelling and charismatic figure, and everyone remembers their first encounter with him in whatever way. But whoever wants to go first, please, the floor is yours.
Let me start. I remember when we were growing up, as my brother over there, and my parents used to talk about Martin Luther King. My dad used to always call him Dr. King. And when he used to mention his name, he used to have a smile on his face, Dr. King. So to me, he was always someone special, always someone important. But in terms of my journey, I went to university and I I use the term, I was seduced by Malcolm X. And at that point, people would always come up to you and say, are you a King person or a Malcolm X person? As if they were mutually exclusive. You're either in one camp or you're in the other camp. And if you were a Malcolm X person, then you were a right and black man, a righteous brother who would stick it to the man. If you were a Martin Luther King person, you were deemed to be a little sort of, little kind of conservative. You'd be a good Christian. And I think part of the problem there was a misreading clearly of who Martin Luther King was. And I suppose what helped me on my particular journey was I happened to go to Atlanta. Can't remember when it was, but I went to Atlanta, and I remember going around the King Museum, and there's an exhibit in the King Museum which has King's marching gear. So you see a denim shirt, blue jeans, and a big pair of boots. Now the thing is, I thought I knew a lot about Dr. King, but every time, I don't know if you probably may see this yourself, every time you see Dr. King, and you saw it there, he's either in a dog collar or he's wearing a suit. He's always wearing a suit, he's always presented in a particular way. And I remember thinking, I've never seen an image of Dr. King at that point anyway, at that juncture, in these clothes. He's always presented in a particular way. And I remember thinking, what is it then about Dr. King what else is it about Dr. King that I don't know? That, he's been presented in a particular way for a specific reason. And that really sort of encouraged me to actually look behind the image to find out more about Dr. King. And in doing that, I saw a whole different aspect of Dr. King, this radical revolutionary figure, and brother pointed out, a revolutionary of love. And that really sort of helped to reconcile in my mind who this person was. So, as Hannah has pointed out, it no longer was the case that you were either a King person or a Malcolm X person. I always say that the two sides of one coin, and you could clearly see that towards the end of both their lives, they were heading in a similar sort of direction, and I would argue a left sort of direction. But that sort of redeemed King for me to the point where, I felt absolutely comfortable with everything he stood for, and would actually stand up and stand against those individuals who would argue that, King was a conservative. King was sometimes people use terms like an Uncle Tom, and even Malcolm X for his sins often called him Reverend Chicken Wing, and, other sorts of pejorative terms. To me, that's a clear misreading of who King was and what he stood for.
Shall I go next? It's such a good question, a huge question. I'm sure everyone in this room has a different personal answer to this. For me personally, you can tell from my accent that I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Canada. I'm a mixed race person. My dad is from Sri Lanka. My mom is English. And within my big mixed race family are people who are Asian and Black and white. And so growing up with that kind of cocktail around me, I always really appreciated and found so resonant King's words about the color of your skin doesn't matter as much as the content of your character, just as a very young child. And I grew up in the 80s and 90s in North America, where King was an icon. There was already Martin Luther King Day that was celebrated in America. So there was an element to which he was a ubiquitous icon of this kind of vision of a multiracial world, of what those possibilities could be. When I started working at St. Paul's Cathedral, much like your experience, we kind of found out, oh, there's this anniversary that's happening, and what should we do? And it kind of found its way onto my desk, as I was the person who wouldn't let it go, that we really needed to mark how important this was, that he was here in London, and that London had such an important place within the diaspora conversations about Black liberation. And so that really changed my personal research trajectory at that point. I was in the middle of my PhD, and that's when I started to focus. I had been working more on questions that we've already been talking about today, about this dual-sided nature of Christianity, where Christianity can be used as an imperial weapon to harm and subjugate, or it can be used as a discourse of liberation. And starting to work on this event around Martin Luther King, it opened up a new set of questions for me in the 1960s, in the era of civil rights. And so that's now led to my professional career changing, and that's why I now work in the work I do as a lecturer in Black British history. And these are the trajectories that I'm really interested in pursuing. I hope that's a good answer, but I'm sure everyone has a good answer to this one.
It's an excellent answer.
Yeah, I mean, in brief, because at one level, some of what Richard said is my story as well. I've grown up in the same household in which King was an icon and really was an exemplar for Black excellence. At a time when there were very few Black role models, certainly in terms of 1970s, 1980s Bradford, where we were born and brought up. Very much a white world with white leadership and white people at the forefront. Although King was long gone, long dead by the time we were growing up, there was a sense in which he was such an exemplar for excellence that was bound to inspire you, and it certainly inspired me. I think much later when I was at university, that's where I discovered, I guess, an interest in theology, and was very much involved in the kind of anti-apartheid movement and been involved within the chaplaincy at Birmingham University in terms of the student Christian movement. And all that was great in terms of social gospel, but was again still very white. I was like the only Black student at the time who was a part of those networks. And so when I discovered Black liberation theology and the work of James Cone, and then began to read that, and then think about doing my postgraduate work, doing my doctorate, that then brought me back to King, because Cone in the later years he wrote a book called Malcolm and Martin in America, where he looks at the importance of Martin Luther King in terms of being a social prophet and being one of the architects of Black liberation theology. And Cone's understanding of King, which I would agree with, is one that King offers this tantalizing vision, I think, for Black radicalism, that both affirms and critiques it. It affirms it in the sense in which King is undoubtedly proud of being Black. So even later on in his life, he does begin tentatively to own the language of Black power. But at the same point, he's never a nationalist. And it's interesting that Black liberation theology has not really gone down the nationalist path. Because for King, he would also say that our Blackness is held in tension with our Christian identity. And it's held in tension with the God revealed in Jesus Christ that still loves everybody. So our enemies are not white people. Our enemy is white supremacy and the illegitimate use of power. It's not people per se, it's systems of injustice that are perpetrated and overseen by people. And King, I think, is important because King then reminds us that if you have a revolution, but it's underpinned by hate and not love, then it will ultimately consume itself and lead to further injustice. And we've seen that with lots of revolutionary movements across the world, where they start with good intent to transform it, and then they almost end up inevitably being as abusive and as dehumanizing as the regimes that they sought to overcome in the first place.
Thank you. Those are really excellent answers. My next question is also for everyone, and interpret as you see fit. I think that what we've touched upon, especially with your question earlier today, Duncan, is that there's a tendency in the public discourse for Martin Luther King's legacy to be used almost as like beating down of more radical expressions of Blackness. It's like, but what would Martin Luther King think? And perhaps, I want to know, what do you think the origin of that is? Is that his pacifism? Is that just something that was completely out of his control? Because I think that Malcolm X, rather, is not really used in the same way. And how can we reclaim his actual radical legacy from being weaponized by whiteness against revolutionary blackness? It's a big question, sorry.
I just have one thought is to really, as a historian, you know, my instinct is always to root people in the words and the context in which they're speaking. And I think that there has been some censoring of the power and legacy of Martin Luther King through things like Martin Luther King Day becoming an abstraction rather than knowing the power and legacy of his words and the fullness of his teachings. I think particularly where we are now in our politics, it's an important moment to emphasize Martin Luther King's socialism, his Christian socialism, and the moral roots of it, because that very much takes you away from the directions where his memory is trying to be appropriated on the right, and you know, his anti-capitalism, the way that he wanted to actually, you know, make a more equal world. I think those are radical ideas that get you away from the sense that he just wanted everyone to be equal within a broken system.
Yeah, and very briefly, because I would probably like to give more space to Richard, who's actually written the book on Martin Luther King. So, you know, I mean, so he knows much more about King than I do. I think for me, I think this is something that Richard did say, is that I think because for a lot of us, King gets fossilized in the I Have a Dream speech in 1963. He dies in 68. But it's almost as if like those last 5 years don't matter, because he's at his peak in 63, and because we see it in utopian terms, then we then miss the way in which his clear radicalism is on show later. So for example, just very quickly, prior to Obama being elected president first time in 2008, there was this whole flaring up of a controversy that comes from the words of Jeremiah Wright Jr., who was a pastor of a prominent church in Chicago, who had preached a sermon taken out of context where he said, "God damn America." And because he had been Obama's pastor, Obama then had to effectively distance himself from this preacher of hate, because how can this black man be talking about God damn America? What is ironic is that Jeremiah Wright takes that sermon, or takes that snippet from King himself. So King himself in a sermon in 1967 says, America calls itself like the New Jerusalem. We see ourselves, it says, as the fulfillment of ancient Israel, whom God has blessed in the scriptures. And it says, well, yes, if that's the case, then let's look at the scriptures and see that when Israel does not do what God asks her to do, God damns her. Therefore, it says, if we want to call ourselves the new Israel, then we have to acknowledge that we may well be under the judgment of the same God who we talk about, God bless America, we're blessed as the new Israel, then actually we could well be damned. And it may well be, God damn America. So it's ironic that a speech that then becomes inflammatory all over YouTube, that forces Obama to distance himself from Jeremiah Wright, the source of it comes from this so-called anemic sellout pacifist who was talking about God damn America.
Yeah, and just to sort of just pick up on that, I think if you want to know the real King, look at his sermons and look at his speeches, particularly between 65 and 68. That's where you see the real radicalism. I mean, you know, what I find fascinating is, you know, King is at his zenith between 63 and 64. So in 1964, he's Time Magazine's Man of the Year. And then by 1965, he starts to critique the Vietnam War. And by 1967, in some spheres, he's persona non grata. So, you know, he's a man who, you know, some who were formerly sort of, you know, King aficionados have said, well, actually, this guy is segueing into the Vietnam conversation because he's taken civil rights as far as he can go. And he's basically run out of track. You know, for other people, I think it was Ralph Bunche, you know, the first black man to receive a Nobel Peace Prize, who criticized King and saying that, he's basically doing a disservice to the civil rights movement. But, just to sort of pick up on what my brother said, I think the sermon he had prepared and he was going to deliver the Sunday, so he was killed during the week, but that following Sunday, he was going to deliver a sermon which said, why America may well go to hell. So for King, he was very critical of the direction America was going. So I find it fascinating how anyone could actually read those sermons or read those speeches and then decide that King is some sort of card-carrying conservative. I don't know how people can interpret that from what King has to say. Clearly, this man is very critical of America, very critical of capitalism, very critical of racism, very critical of, as I said during my talk, militarism, the triple evils, as he described it. So for me, if you want to find out the real essence of who King was, read those sermons, because this is King when he's basically just sort of bearing his soul to the nation. This is him speaking properly and truthfully to America. That's the real King, not the King of 1963.
I wish we could drop the mics, but I think we might break them. But thank you. I think you've kind of given us quite a few of these, but Richard, I wanted to ask if we have any particular stories or vignettes of King that might shake up that image a bit more.
I do, but just give me a minute.
Okay.
Just give me a minute.
Shall I move on and then
Yeah.
Hannah, I was thinking there's this gap between Black History Month as it's experienced. I was born in '96, like my Black History Month was mostly focusing on Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, which feels strange because it's Black British History Month. And my question is, how do we go about recovering all of this Black British history? Like there's been so many excellent exhibitions, but this whole legacy of British civil rights has been obscured to us for reasons that are fairly obvious. But how do we start with that? Where do we begin in like reclaiming that history of radicalism that is indigenous to London and to the rest of the UK?
That's a great question and a big question as well. And I think what's wonderful is that there is such a huge tradition in this country of writing down, preserving, and sharing Black histories in communities, in archive spaces like the George Padmore Institute or the Black Cultural Archives. And we're seeing the academy, the universities slowly catching up. We're seeing schools. There's a lot of school teachers who are really willing to be inventive and learn more and add to the curriculum, but often without a statutory requirement to do so. So we're in this really interesting place right now where there's resources around and there's willingness. So often people are short of time. In universities, there's now 10 lectures in Black British history in the country as of this year. So we're at a moment where I think much more can be done to excavate not just the really important stories about Black British experience within these islands, but contextualizing Britain in its biggest sense, that Britain wasn't just these 4 islands for hundreds of years. Britain was also the Caribbean, it was also India, Sri Lanka, it was also Hong Kong. You know, we must not lie to ourselves about what British history is. We have to talk about British history and Black British history within a perspective that extends beyond these islands. So I think that I'm hopeful that we'll get more of those interconnected histories, transnational histories that are looking at experiences moving in and between nations. And I think that people like King or Bayard Rustin, because their lives have been so well documented, are quite useful to look at the kind of connection points that they make in with British radical culture, and then move from there to looking at Claudia Jones and all of the great reach of her radical life, and Queen Mother Moore. Like there's so many wonderful Black radicals whose lives have been researched and need to continue to be researched, and the interconnections between Black intellectual traditions need to continue to be researched. So I guess it's a sort of an incomplete answer of saying there's stuff out there where people can do some really interesting things, but it's an important moment that we keep extending that work.
Thank you. It's almost like at the end of every essay, it's like more research is needed. And that's definitely the vibe. I wanted to ask, actually, I might go back to you, Richard, if you're ready.
That's a pun, isn't it, Richard, if you're ready?
So
I suppose for me, it's just finding out more about Dr. King. So I remember being in Jamaica in 1986, and there it was, I can't remember who it was. Yeah, it was Don King of all, the boxing promoter. Weird, very weird. But anyway, he received in Jamaica the Martin Luther King Award. And I remember thinking, well, what's that all about? Well, apparently, every January, or for quite a few Januaries in the 60s, Dr. King would actually visit Jamaica, go there for rest and, respite. It was a holiday, but also he would use it for critical thinking time. And he would also use it to write. So some of the books that he wrote, particularly his last book, the ideas were sketched out in Jamaica at the time. So to me, it's about sort of finding those just interesting bits of Dr. King's life that kind of make the connections between different places and different spaces. So obviously this evening, or rather this afternoon, we've found out about Dr. King and his impact on British people, but he also had a massive impact on folk within the Caribbean. And I think more work needs to be done, particularly from a Jamaican perspective, in terms of, Dr. King and his visits to Jamaica. How did that inform his thinking? What impact did that have on the Jamaican people at the time? Because at the time, Jamaica, if anybody knows Jamaica in the 1960s, it became independent in 62, but by 1967, there were serious upheavals in Jamaican society because, the so-called gains of independence had materialized in any particular way. And the Black Jamaicans in particular, who formed 95% of the population, felt as if they were still under the grip of colonial empire and the setup. So it's about that, really. It's about discovering more about King, his life and his influence.
Thank you. I decided to go back to you because I think this question is one that can be expanded. So for Anthony, I think that we're discussing over the course of this afternoon, speaking from within institutions that are historically and even currently anti-Black. We spoke about the Rose Must Fall campaign, and the University of Oxford has its own legacies of anti-Blackness, of complicity of colonialism. St. Paul's Cathedral, where Martin Luther King spoke, is a key figure within the legacy of the British Crown and Empire. And I guess I really wanted to know more about how does one navigate that as a Black liberation theologian, as a Black person, being in these spaces that are very much emblematic of domination and anti-Blackness. Do you feel at some points that you're sometimes sanctioning these institutions by your presence, or is there something like a more nuanced approach or narrative that can emerge from these spaces?
Yes, a great question. And interesting enough, it's one that gets discussed, well, certainly within Oxford. I mean, there is a Black Staff Association that I'm a part of, and we regularly have conversations amongst the staff. And the staff, interesting enough, actually numbers more Black people than you would imagine in lots of different stuff, in areas. So some of us are academics, some of us are in some of the ancillary organisations. So Oxford is a rich institution that owns huge amounts of Oxford City in terms of gardens, libraries, museums, and Black people work in all those different places. And there's a sense which each and every one of us has to make his or her own way of kind of making peace with that. I mean, my view has always been to try and be a subversive presence within it. So I often tell students, certainly in terms of my own college at Regent's Park, I'm the first Black academic staff to work there. So black people worked there before, but like they've always been cooks and cleaners. Not there's nothing wrong with cooks and cleaners, of course, but that's what they have been. So I'm the first member of the faculty. And what I have to say is, both in that place and in other places, is that when these institutions were created, they never had me in mind. So what I do in it is entirely then down to me in terms of, am I happy just to be there? And just to bask in the kind of reflected, hey, look at me, I work at Oxford University. And there are some people who do that, and that's fine for them. I try not to judge other people's actions. Or more importantly, I say to myself, so now that I'm here, what can I do in order to create space so that other people can come, like me? And also, how then can I sort of disturb the narrative of how this institution thinks about itself going forward, given this past? So one of the things that's come interesting enough, I mean, I started last January. And within a few months of starting, first we had lockdown, then death of George Floyd, resurgence of Black Lives Matter. And those three things have done, I think, an interesting moment in Oxford to be there as a Black liberation theologian, probably the first Black liberation theologian to be there, which is that conversations that the university was not willing to have even up until 2 years ago are now taking place. So we talk about decolonizing the curriculum. That would have never happened prior to the death of George Floyd. Constructive conversations about what we do with artifacts in museums, and to talk about decolonizing how we think about the past, but also what we teach people, and the broadening of that. So as we speak, and if you're praying types, I ask for your prayers in that I am in the process of proposing the first Black Liberation Theology course in Oxford University. It goes to the final academic board of the department in a couple of weeks' time. If it gets agreed, it will be taught by me in 2023. That wouldn't have happened if I were not here. And for me, that's not about me then trying to say, hey, look at me, I'm doing this. It's about saying, in teaching this course, how will that then change the mindset and the conscientization of a whole generation of students moving on from this place?
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question. And I think also, that's so crazy, and I will be praying for the Black Liberation Theology course because it's necessary. But one more question, and I think it's something that has been on everyone's mind, that there's been this seismic shift after George Floyd's death, his murder, but we're still trying to articulate what the long tail of that would be and what the reverberations of that will be. And there's a lot of talk about the institutional change, like the D&I policies, all the corporate people that I've been working with are like, oh my gosh, we remember Black people exist, we need to get them into our board as soon as possible. But not a lot of discussion about how that affects people on an individual level. And I just want to ask you all, as people who've thought so much about King and thought so much about these issues, where do you personally feel the next couple of years and next couple of decades are going to take us with these discussions about not just the legacy of King, but the trajectory for Black people and Black inclusion and justice? Do you feel optimistic? Or are you feeling a bit more mixed or more negative about that? This is a big question, so you can answer in a couple of words or just in your like gut feeling.
Don't look at me.
I'll go first. Okay, well, I'll go first and very quickly.
You always say that.
Actually, so as a Christian theologian, I think the thing I would always say is when people say, am I hopeful? My hope lies in God. It doesn't lie in human beings, although clearly we are part of God's economy to bring about change. That quote which I ended my talk there, King says, the arc of the moral universe is long. It is long. Injustice is not going to sue for peace anytime soon. Therefore, the other thing that I build my hope in It seemed God, but it seemed God through human institutions, that we have to work in solidarity. So any person who feels that it's their own individual mock heroic actions that's going to bring about change, deluding themselves. It's about us working together. And therefore, the importance of the church, I mean, as a Black theologian, I often have a kind of uneasy relationship with the church, because as an institution, it's often much more about inertia and quietism, and certainly in most of our historic denominations now, actually a worry about our futures as we worry about numbers and start trying to get more people in. For all its faults, if we didn't have it, we'd have to invent something like it. And by that I mean that the heart of our faith has to be spirituality, because that's the thing that keeps you going, that you can't do it in your own strength. We have to do it in the strength of the power of the Spirit that enables us both to work with each other, but ultimately to work with God, and to believe that we are signs of change, so that in our church life, however imperfect it is, that we are a sign of good news. And to go back to King again, like the arc of the moral universe is long, but it does bend towards justice. And in the end, what the cross tells us is that ultimately God will always have the last word.
I mean, I can't really top that answer because that's an extraordinary answer. I think my thoughts on this are built out of the kind of pragmatic work that I've been doing in universities to try and both like decolonize curriculum, but also to try and ensure that there are more Black students at every level of study. I'm part of the team that is working on the first MA in Black British history in the country. But also to ensure that that program and other programs around the country are helping to see more Black PhD students and more Black professors, because we have, especially in history, one of the least representative and least diverse professorates. Only 0.3% of history professors in the UK are Black. That is an astoundingly small number. So the work that I've been doing with people at organizations like the Stephen Lawrence Research Center, and by learning from groups like Leading Roots and TASO and the Runnymede Trust, there has been a lot of different moments within institutions to push to try and create programs for greater access and pathways for Black scholars of all different ages in the kind of that aftermath of BLM 2 years ago. But there seems like there's also this kind of institutionalized backlash that's happening against that now. It's almost as if university higher ups are like, well, let's move on to the next thing. Let's talk about green at universities. And I think one of the struggles right now is to keep people focused on the work that needs to be done, because some small steps of some beginnings of programs have happened in some universities. They have not happened in all universities, and conversations need to keep taking place. I'm also really conscious of this public backlash against conversations about, what is the place of our public practices of commemoration. And when we saw the statue of Edward Colson go in, that felt like a very liberative moment where the people of Bristol were really actively reflecting on what they want their civic spaces to be and what they want them to include. And a slave owner and mass murderer is not one of those things. We're now seeing groups like Policy Exchange, which is funded, a conservative think tank, which has very close associations with Michael Gove, putting out reports that people like Trevor Phillips are a part of, saying that the past should not be changed, that the past is fixed and must be kept and preserved as it always has been. And the first thing you learn as a historian in your very first class is that we are constantly writing history. And so if you're going to say that history has finished at a certain point, you're saying history is dead. And I don't think that we want to espouse that kind of an attitude. So those are two threats that I see at the moment, but I think there's also a lot of possibility in the legacies of what happened in the summer after George Floyd was murdered, that people have taken time to educate themselves and be more literate about the issues of racism, structural racism in our country. We just need to make sure that that education is transformed into action and sustained commitment to change.
Thank you.
I think for me, it's all about ensuring that this particular issue stays on the agenda. You know, some of us in here can remember what happened after the terrible killing of Stephen Lawrence. And that, you know, was a moment for reckoning. That was our version of George Floyd. And that was 1993. And there was lots of soul searching in both the church and also society. And it led to the Macpherson report and then the sort of the coining of the phrase institutional racism. But from a sort of a tangible perspective, how much really changed with regard to racism being addressed, with regard to, institutions, systemic and structural racism, it's still there. So I think the issue or the challenge is, how can we see substantive, tangible change as a result of all the conversations that have taken place since May the 25th, 2020. I mean, like my brother, I'm a Christian, and, I'm in the hope business as a Christian. And I think change is possible, but it will take time. Racism didn't start with the death of, or rather the murder of George Floyd, and it won't end anytime soon, tragically. I think it involves all of us in the work to bring about change. So my hope is that we're still not just talking about these issues in a couple of years' time, but we're actually working together to ensure that there is real change, particularly as a Christian, within churches, so that churches truly are inclusive, truly do embrace diversity and issues to do with equity. And I suppose one of the things, just finally, that is encouraging is the fact that, I've noticed, particularly within my denomination, the Church of England, you have the report from Lament to Action, but I've also seen many denominations this year mark Black History Month, and also say that they've got a commitment to actually celebrate or mark Racial Justice Sunday, which is the second Sunday in February next year. And these things were totally off the agenda in previous years. So you're seeing people beginning to have a conversation, and it's it's not an easy thing because historically we haven't had those conversations, as my brother alluded to before. So it's important to break the silence, but where do we go after that? What direction do we take after that? So I would say I'm confident that change will happen, but I wouldn't put a time or a date on that.
Thank you all so much for your time. Can we give a big round of applause, please?
I just add my thanks to those that have already been expressed, particularly to Udoka for chairing this session. We are delighted that Udoka is our most recently appointed deacon at the church. So we're very pleased to have you as part of the team. Thank you also to Anthony, to Richard and to Hannah. We have some little gifts for you. That's got Hannah's name on it. That is Richard's name and Anthony. So thank you to you for coming. There's just some books there for you as a little thank you. We're going to do a little bit of housekeeping now. We're finishing now, but we are restarting at 7 o'clock. So if you're able to come back this evening, we will be hearing an excerpt from Martin Luther King's sermon in his own voice, preaching it. And that is the sermon that includes the phrase, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." So we'll be hearing him say that later. And then we will be joined by Emmanuel, who is already here, who's going to be speaking to us about the practice of community organizing and King's legacy in community organizing. And we're also going to be joined by Ife, who's going to be talking about some of the work she does in Black legal representation. It's going to be a fantastic evening. And to top it all, Impact Dance, so I think you just heard a little bit of stomping earlier. We now have a first-class dance studio on the roof here, and they're going to be doing a fantastic dance performance for us called The Journey to Justice. So do come along this evening.